Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning. And thank you for last night. I will go through this presentation in a couple of stages. I intend to this morning, this is a new speech. I've never given this before anyone. I have for years been working on a new theory as to the nature of hypnosis. I presume most of you somewhere along the line have read a book about hypnosis, and no doubt somewhere you read in that book that even though it has been around for probably 1,000 years, there is still no theory that is generally accepted as being the nature of hypnosis. They still don't know exactly what it is. And theories come and go, but they tend to become disproved one after another. I have been working on this theory. I first had the idea in 1976, believe it or not. Kind of left it for a while, came back to it, and for at least the last 5 or 6 years have been perfecting it. And this is the very first audience that I am laying it out for. So the first 2 or 3 minutes, if you'll just bear with me, it is done in fairly technical jargon, but that is to attract and to get the attention of the PhD psychologists and the experimentalists. And then once that is over, I will lay it out step by step how this theory developed, where it came from, what it's all about. I think it makes sense, and I will invite you at the end to criticize it and critique it. The reason I'm going to post this video on as many sites as I can find is I am essentially going to slap it up there and say, tell me what's wrong with this. Tear it apart. Show me what doesn't work. Does anybody have any research that refutes this? Does anybody have any research that supports this? What's wrong with this? And if I do not get a lot of criticism, or if I do not get many people stepping forward and telling me what's wrong with it, I then will take the next step. I intend to write it up and publish it as a peer review paper. Now, I do have a collaborator, Lisa Gilbert, has been collaborating with me in terms of putting the theory together. She could not be here with me today, and I did decide to dedicate this presentation and this research to my best friend. This is Mr. Bob Davies, who passed away 3 weeks ago in a skydiving accident. I had known Bob for 47 years. He was a roommate of mine in college. We were fraternity brothers. We were best friends for 47 years. He was also a public speaker, had a horrible accident, and tomorrow is his memorial. I'll be giving the eulogy tomorrow in California, which is why I will be leaving here around noon to catch a plane to go out to California, Irvine, and be at his memorial service. But I wanted to dedicate that to Bob, who was my best friend forever. And so here is what you would call the abstract. This is what the gist of my theory is about. This is entirely original as an idea. There is simply nowhere on the internet that I have found any reference to what I am doing here. My theory is predicated on a neurological condition known as neural mutual inhibition. It exists in various parts of the brain. It is usually a higher order part of the brain, and where you see it is called neural mutual inhibition, and this is what my theory is predicated on neurologically, where you have competing systems that actively inhibit each other. This is a new theory, totally new in its conception. If there is anyone out there that knows anyone that has ever had this idea before, I would like to know so I can attribute it, but the theory is sociobiologic in nature. What that means is it combines both a biological definition or description of what hypnosis is, that's the neurological mutual inhibition part, and it also combines with it a sociological explanation. I believe it becomes hypnotism or hypnosis when you pair this neurological state with verbal suggestion and the rituals that are involved in a hypnosis induction. So it is known as a sociobiological theory. Mutual inhibition, the concept itself, was first proposed in the 1950s as a theoretical construct. The foundational work was done in the 60s and 70s, much of it by Philip Teitelbaum, very famous psychologist out of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. So any of the researchers watching this who want to track down the original foundational research, if they Google mutual inhibition and they track down the lateral hypothalamic syndrome, is what it was titled as, they will see all of the foundational experiments that Teitelbaum did with rats and with cats, laying the foundation for this theory. It evolved and has continued to evolve. There's still quite a bit of research going on in the animal field, but if anybody watching this wants a perfect example of what I am talking about as it applies to the human mind, there was a very good study done in 2010 by the Harvard researchers. They call it the sleep switch study, and anyone who wants to go after that and see a perfect example of what I'm talking about as it applies to human beings, I would strongly recommend they dig this study up and read it, because it gives an excellent description of what neural mutual inhibition is, how it applies to the human mind, and in this particular case, the sleep switch studying was the battle that goes on between being awake and being asleep. And I've taken the liberty, that is the information, that's the title of the article, these are the authors, and that is the journal in which it can be found. So anybody who wants to kind of find out what I'm talking about from a purely scientific point of view, that would be the foundational information. If they simply read that article, they will know what I'm talking about. That's the abstract. Now for the rest of us, this is what I'm talking about. If it is mutual inhibition, if my theory is correct, it does have some implications. First of all, the implication of neural inhibition, every neural inhibition, mutual inhibition situation that has been found in the human brain contains a switch. Mutual inhibition, as it pertains to sleeping, is quite simply, when someone goes to sleep, it looks like you're turning something off. I mean, a person's awake, they're active, they're alert, they go to sleep, they're somnolent, they're not moving around. Kind of looks like you turned something off, doesn't it? Turns out you're very much turning something on. Studies have demonstrated conclusively now that when you go to sleep, you have a different part of the brain that becomes activated, that is turned on, that puts the animal to sleep, a completely different system, and what it does is it inhibits the wakefulness circuits. There are mutual inhibiting circuits. When you are awake, it inhibits the circuits that put you to sleep. A switch is thrown at a chemical level, a neurotransmitter, and then the person goes to sleep but inhibits wakefulness. It's mutual inhibition, and this is how it applies to sleep. This is how it applies, for example, to narcolepsy. Turns out narcolepsy is a classic example of a mutually inhibiting system, and the key to narcolepsy is that the people that have that are lacking what is known as orexin, which is a neurotransmitter found deep in the hypothalamus. They have a lack of that neurotransmitter, so the brain is unable to control the switch, so they're falling asleep uncontrollably. They have found that that is a neural inhibition switch, to give you an idea of what it's about. So the implications are, if it turns out that hypnosis and wakeful and consciousness is indeed what I think it is, which is a mutual inhibition situation, there's going to be a switch, and that switch is what they should be looking for. There will be a switch that throws it back and forth between consciousness and a person going into trance, and what the researchers, I believe, should be looking for, and none of them are, is that chemical switch. Because all the research indicates every switch that has been found is relatively few neurons. It usually is just a couple hundred neurons. It's not a big system. It's usually a very small switch. But the switch controls whether you're awake or you're asleep. And if there is a switch that's controlling whether you are conscious or in a trance, the researchers, if my theory is correct, should be directing their attention to locating that switch. And the implications are profound. If there's a switch controlling that, well, theoretically, you could control the switch. You can do it either chemically or electronically, and think of what the implications are. You could throw that switch and keep a person in a trance, or throw the switch and keep them fully conscious. Or perhaps take a person who is a poor subject, and if you can control the switch, make them a good subject. If what I'm saying is correct, the implications therapeutically are huge, and no one is looking for the switch. So this is why I think that this theory has such implications. And I'm going to make a statement and then move on. I first heard about this from a professor I had in graduate school, Dr. Dave Wogan, and he described it to me. It was still in the experimental stage. They were describing, he had just finished doing postdoctoral work with Philip Teitelbaum. He had spent 2 years after he got his PhD studying with Philip Teitelbaum when they were doing these rat studies about mutual inhibition. And he described it to us while I was in graduate school, and they predicted back in '76 that they would eventually find this neural system for wake and sleep. And it's precisely what the Harvard study came up with in 2010. And the thing that was so interesting to me is, as he was describing it to me in 1976, I remember thinking to myself, you know, hypnosis kind of looks like that. Hypnosis looks like a mutual inhibition switch. I will demonstrate what I'm talking about. I would need a volunteer if you wouldn't mind. Would you help me for just a moment, sir?
Not a good
Tim,
subject, but
that's the beauty. It doesn't matter if you're a good subject or not. That's going to have implications. Tim, would you face the group, and would you all take a look at Tim? You've probably seen this before, but let me explain what I mean by I believe it being a mutual inhibition switch. Tim, would you spell this word for me, psychoanalysis? Do the best you can.
P-S-Y-C-H-O-N-A-N-A.
There he goes. Okay, come on back here again. I'll do it again. Can you remember the name of your 8th grade teacher?
No.
There you go. Try. Do your best. There he goes again. See what he's doing? I don't mean to interrupt. I'm asking Tim questions that are not located in his conscious or short-term memory. He has to stop for a moment to access that information. Most of us do not walk around with complicated words in our memory or as distant memories, like who was your 8th grade teacher. He did what nearly everyone does. He stopped looking at me, broke eye contact, stared up into space looking for the answer. Do you recall doing that? Mm-hmm. Okay. When you had your eyes open, so far as I could tell, you were looking at that light up there.
I was looking at that thing.
Okay, when actually you were looking out there, just so you know. It's on video. just so you know. For the record, you were not looking at that. But you thought you were looking at that. Yeah. So your eyes were wide open. You think you were looking at that. The question is, I had asked you to spell a word or remember your teacher. What were you seeing in those moments? You're doing it again. Come on back here for a second. You can't help it. We all do this. And doesn't that kind of look like a switch being thrown? When you ask a person a question that requires that kind of answer, many of them roll their eyes back in their head, they break eye contact. Then you ask them, do you realize you looked away from me? And he's a perfect example. I was looking up there. I got video proof. He was looking out there. He wasn't even looking where he thought he was looking. And then you say, well, what were you seeing? Psychoanalysis. I was seeing the name of my teacher. So let me get this straight. Your eyes are wide open. You're fully conscious. You're looking at that light, but you're seeing the word psychoanalysis. Do you think you're fully conscious in that instant? Well, no. We go in and out. Consciousness is not continuous. Consciousness is a big broken series of things. We go in and out of that state thousands of times a day. And back in '76 as a graduate student, when Dr. Wogan is describing to us the Teitelbaum's new theories of mutual inhibition and the switch being involved in the higher cortical systems, I recall I had the insight, that's kind of what I see when I hypnotize people. They break eye contact, they come back again. That looks to me like a mutually inhibiting switch. That was the first insight I had that kind of got me going. And we all do this. Thank you. Give Tim a round of applause. So it really does look like you're throwing a switch back and forth. Notice how fast that happens. Again, the research is bearing all this out. So I'm going to make 4 very broad assumptions in this presentation. I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I'm going to be using terms and making statements that I am fully aware are controversial. But for what I'm saying today to make any sense at all, we have to have a common language. So I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to give me some leeway just for this presentation. I'm going to use the word trance. I think it's all a trance. Scientists don't use that word. They will talk about focused attention, attentiveness. They won't use the word because of its Baroque connotations and all of its spiritual. I will use that word because it encompasses, I think when you talk to the people about a trance, they know what it is you're talking about. And when I say it's all a trance, this is titled The Nature of Hypnosis, but I am of the opinion that the state of hypnosis, the neural condition that is involved there, is really no different than driving past your exit on a freeway, pulling into the driveway and asking yourself, how did I get here? It's no different than daydreaming. It's no different than wool gathering. It's no different than it was no different than the state of mind you saw him in for that brief instant when he had his eyes open, wasn't seeing what he was looking at, wasn't hearing what was going on around him. I'm going to say it's all a trance. And I am going to be using that term. I do understand that's controversial. There are many people that will argue to the teeth that hypnosis and transcendental meditation are completely different states of mind. I got into an argument with someone on a radio show once, the TM people. It's absolutely completely different. I personally disagree, but I will use trance as an all-encompassing term just for the purposes of this presentation, so we're all speaking the same language. Also, I'm going to use a term that I do know is controversial. I'm going to talk about normal conscious state. I'm going to say this trance-like state as opposed to a normal conscious state. When Tim was looking at me, listening to what I was saying, being a normal conscious state, when he was staring off into space, not seeing what he was looking at, I'm going to call that the trance-like state. I am fully aware that that is open open for discussion. Many people say that there is no such thing as a normal conscious state. In a given day, you could be happy, sad, angry, bored. You could be in a million different states. There's actually no such thing as a normal conscious state. For the purposes of this presentation, I will use that term rather loosely, but I'm going to be talking about normal conscious states versus a trance. And I do know they're controversial, but if you'll just bear with me for the purposes of this program, those are the terms I will choose to use today. Again, I'm going to make another state that I realize is controversial. I often will point to people at random and say, could you define hypnosis for me? And I do that to many hypnotists, hypnotherapists, and stage hypnotists, and a very common answer I get back. Hypnosis is a state of deep relaxation characterized by heightened suggestibility. I dispute that. I would like to point out that the relaxation has nothing to do with hypnosis whatsoever. The relaxation is an artifact. The relaxation is a side effect. The relaxation is a holdover from Braid when he coined it hypnosis and started talking about deep sleep and deep relaxation. Hypnotists could just as easily get a good subject and suggest they are stiff and rigid as a bar of steel and stretch them across two chairs. The exact opposite of relaxation. Relaxation has nothing at all to do with the neurological state known as hypnosis or a trance. I do know that's open for dispute, but I happen to think it's a complete artifact, and it's just it's a much more pleasant way to get hypnotized than getting strung across two chairs, but it has nothing to do whatsoever with the actual state of hypnosis. And the last premise is that the trance itself will be characterized by a neurological state that is a lower level of control, less inhibition, and a reduction in the amount of reality testing. If you distill down to what characterizes hypnosis or trance as opposed to the normal state, there are three overriding characteristics. Number one, they are at a lower level of control. If you tell a person in hypnosis you are stuck like glue to the seat of your chair and they accept that suggestion, they don't get out of the chair. They don't reality test. But the fact of the matter is, there is still no accepted theory. Here's where they are today in terms of experimentation. It's actually a very exciting period of time. They started using MRIs and PET scans about 10 years ago. And the leading researcher in that direction is David Spiegel, which is kind of cool because I met his father on 3 different occasions. His dad was Herbert Spiegel. And Herb Spiegel from Columbia was one of the great forerunners in the 70s, came out with some really classic studies. He's the one that gave us the eye roll, first one that kind of identified the eye roll and to notice it. He developed what we call the grade 5 syndrome, where he started characterizing good subjects in terms of personality characteristics. He was really a pioneer in many senses in terms of moving hypnosis forward, and his son has picked up the mantle and now is using PET scans and MRIs. But here's what they're doing, and here's where I think they're going wrong. I've read most of Spiegel's studies, and I have been in communication with him. I have sent him emails, which he has been kind enough to answer. And what they're doing, they're all excited about it, is they're going with MRIs, and they are taking a control group and asking them to do certain mental tasks while they are in an MRI, and then they take the highly hypnotizable groups. What I think is a mistake on their part is they are testing only the really good hypnotic subjects, that top 5%. There might be something weird about that group that doesn't apply to the other 95%. You're certainly going to get the most dramatic responses and the cleanest responses, but you are skewing your group. And he will compare the highly hypnotizable with the average group, and for the very first time, we are finding very real, measurable differences. They are finding, for example, that when a person is in hypnosis, there are increases in certain networks in the brain. Let me explain. The brain is a very complicated machine, and when you do almost anything, it's not a single part of the brain that lights up. It's a variety of parts of the brain that would be involved, let's say, in locomotion, or if you were locuting, if you were speaking, if you're smelling something. It's not just one part of the brain. So what they've done is they've organized these parts of the brain into what they call networks. And they have one that they call the executive control network, when you are making decisions. Another one is the default mode network, which surprised them because they put people on MRI machines and they told them just to lie there still, relax your entire body, and they saw this whole network start lighting up. They expected things to slow down. They saw a bunch of stuff lighting up, and they call that the default mode network. And then they have a salience network, where if you're doing something, solving creative problems, they've identified networks. And when they put these hypnotic subjects on the MRI compared to a control group, there are very real differences. I'll tell you exactly, I don't want to misrepresent their thing, so I'll tell you exactly what they're finding, and you will find this particular thing repeated in most of their experiments. They see a decrease in activity in the default mode network. Default mode network is when you're lying at rest, you're not supposed to be doing anything. The hypnotized subjects see a lower amount of activity than the control group, measurable lower. They see greater functional connectivity between the executive control network and the salience network. This threw me for a loop because I'm not familiar with all the new terms, and when they say that you see greater functional connectivity between the salience and the executive control, I assume that to mean there's more connections going on, right? That's not really what it means. It turns out functional connectivity could be any kind of, the connection could go from the executive control to the thalamus, to the hypothalamus, and then to the salience network, and they consider that an increase in connectivity. That's functional connectivity as opposed to real connectivity. But when I see an increase in connectivity from the point of view of mutual inhibition, I would expect that. That connectivity is what's tamping things down or releasing things. In mutual inhibition, you have to have connections to tell it to go down or go up. So interpreting it from a mutual inhibition point of view, that's what I would expect. That's not how they're interpreting it. They're interpreting it as a different level of connectivity. They're looking at all as excitatory mechanisms. And it turns out you can have some nervous systems that are mutually exciting. When one fires, it causes the other to fire, which causes the other to fire. That's mutual excitation. I'm talking about mutual inhibition. One fires, the other goes down. What would you expect to see? You would expect to see an increase in one and a decrease in the other. That's exactly what they are finding. They're not finding new systems firing. In other words, they're not saying a person in hypnosis versus a control group. The control group is firing this, this, and this part. The hypnosis group is firing a different part. That's not what's happening. They're firing the same exact parts, but they're seeing increases and decreases and more connectivity between certain parts. That is what you would expect to find if it was mutual inhibition, not if you were seeing mutually exciting systems. So that, I believe, adds as a support to my theory, and that is how they are interpreting all of their studies. The very first thing I did is I went to Google and I Googled hypnosis and mutual inhibition. Nothing came up. So I Googled, mutually inhibitory circuits. Very little came up. Animal experiments, the things they're still doing. I spent hours, every combination of words I could think of, and I finally stumbled onto the Harvard study. I could not find anything on Google that talked about mutual inhibition and hypnosis, and I was coming to the conclusion maybe it went nowhere. Maybe it was a theory that died. Maybe, they did the animal studies and it never transmitted. Maybe it was just a bad idea. I mean, here we are. Last I heard of it was in the 70s. It looks like nothing became of it. And then I stumbled into the Harvard study. And the Harvard study changed everything. Because the Harvard study of 2010, they called it the flip-flop theory of sleep. Instead of calling it mutual inhibition, they called it the flip-flop theory. I'll show you the study, and I'll show you why it is so foundational to what I'm doing. The Harvard sleep study did exactly what Dave Wogan predicted. They looked at sleep, and they said that when an animal goes to sleep, it looks like you're turning something off. This is it. But you're actually turning something on. So this is a big description. And then they talk about the actual act of going to sleep. It might take some people 15 or 20 minutes or even longer to get to sleep. But when they fall asleep, it's usually a couple of seconds at most. The actual act of falling asleep is very quick, sometimes milliseconds. So quick, you can't even be conscious of it. Have you ever tried to be aware of going to sleep? So they start out by saying, just like Wogan had predicted, this is not turning something off, it's very much turning something on. And then down here, I love them, they start talking about mutually inhibiting systems. What you have, for the first time I saw it referenced, going to sleep, waking up is active mutual inhibition. These systems fire against each other. And there's a switch involved, and that's why they call it sleep switching theory, also known as the flip-flop theory of sleep. And they go into a big, long description of it, which is basically exactly, almost word for word, what Dr. Wogan was telling me back in 1976 they would eventually find. They found it. Because they annotate it fully, they give all the background research. This is probably what's happening in hypnosis. If you ever saw a person going into hypnosis, think about our hypnotic inductions, the old classic ones. Pick a spot, take a deep breath, concentrate. I'm going to start counting backwards, 10, 9. At some point, you'll often see the person, and then when they go, it's very quick. The switch has been thrown. It is very similar to what you see in sleep, very similar to what these guys are describing, and this is what I think the foundation of hypnosis is. I think consciousness inhibits hypnosis. If this is a mutual inhibiting system, they should be looking for the switch. And here's where the switch is going to be. In all likelihood, most of the switches that have been found in humans are located in the lateral hypothalamus. That's why Teitelbaum started out with the lateral hypothalamic syndrome. The hypothalamus seems to have a lot going on. There's also stuff happening in the amygdala, but in all likelihood, they should be looking at the hypothalamus. So, I'm also going to propose some experiments. This is what I think it is. I think it's mutual inhibition. I think this will give you all the background. You read this, anybody who understands hypnosis will read this study and say, yeah, I could see how that applies. Maybe that does apply to hypnosis. Maybe hypnosis is a mutually inhibiting system. The next question is, theories are fine. Anybody can come up with a theory. Is it testable? Yes, this is testable. I'm going to propose some experiments. Simple experiments. If you want to know if it's real or not, if you want to know if it's really mutual inhibition, you should be able to find out in very short order. You can, for example, put subjects in an MRI machine. Anybody. Again, they're studying nothing but the super subjects right now. They may be getting skewed results. You could put Tim, who announced to me, I'm a terrible subject. You could put anybody in an MRI machine. Have them lying there looking at a picture or something. Put a GoPro so that you're filming their eye movements and start asking them questions while they're in the MRI. Can you remember the name of your 8th grade teacher? Do you know how to spell the word acetylcholine? Can you recall who sat in front of you in 8th grade? Get them to recall, and they will do exactly what Tim did. They're going to break eye contact. They're going to switch into the trance while they look for the answer. Chart when that happens with the GoPro. Go back and look at your MRI results. Here's what you're looking for. If there's really a switch making this happen, the switch lights up every time. It lights up when they go into the trance. It'll light up again when they come out of the trance. Every time you'll see beep, 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 every time. You're not going to see an increase in trance, a decrease when they're out of trance. You'll see the switch go off every single time. And you should predict, or you can predict, it's going to be relatively few neurons. The challenge there is we may not, at this point in time, have machines that are sensitive enough to find it. It may take us a while before, but if we do, if the machines can find it, you're going to see a part of the brain light up every single time they roll their eyes back in their head. That is probably your switch. That's one test that could be done easily. I challenge anybody watching this tape who's got access to an MRI machine to run that test. If you don't like that test, here's another test. Take your group of highly hypnotizable subjects. Give them a post-hypnotic suggestion that whenever I say a certain word or use a certain cue, you will drop back into hypnosis again. Use your high suggestibles that'll have the highest number of connections and the most dramatic response. Get them conditioned to a post-hypnotic suggestion, lay them in an MRI, and start putting them in and out and in and out of hypnosis and see if you can find one area that lights up every single time. And if that one area beeps when they go in and when they go out, when they go in and they go out, that is what you should be paying attention to. That, in all likelihood, is where that mutually inhibiting switch is. If you can locate that, and more to the point, if you can figure out how to manipulate it, that changes the entire ball game. And you go back to the existing research, as I did, I went to every piece of research I could find, and here's what I found and what I didn't find. Much of the research that's currently going on, been happening in the last 10 years, is very similar to Spiegel's research. We found this area increasing, this area decreasing. Nobody coming out with new areas. That kind of conforms to mutual inhibition. Nobody is coming out with information or studies that are directly contradicting the mutual inhibition. They don't even mention it. And I believe that if you go back to some of these studies and look at their original source material, look at their MRI studies, that switch may be sitting there the whole time. They may have simply ignored it, not even known to look for it, didn't know what to make of it. Because in this one big study that Spiegel did, one that he was most famous for, and it's such a cool study, was the color one. Do anybody know what the color experiment was? Yeah. Take a piece of cardboard, you have colored rectangles, you put people in an MRI machine. Let's say he's not a good subject, he's a control subject. Show it to him while he's in an MRI. Take a look at the red rectangle, look at the blue one, look at the green one, look at the yellow one. His optic nerves are firing. Different parts of the brain are lighting up. Take a second group, a control group, not hypnotized. Take the color away. Now there's nothing but outlines of rectangles. I want you to open your eyes and imagine that this one's bright red. Imagine this one's blue. Imagine this one's green. Imagine this one's yellow. Totally different parts of the brain light up. Optic nerve isn't firing. Then take a group of highly hypnotized subjects and say to them, when you open your eyes, you'll see the upper right one is bright red. Can you see it? Yeah, it's bright red. Now the other one's blue. Yeah, I see the blue. Tell them, and the same parts of the brain that light up with the first group light up with the second, indicating that these people who are hypnotized are seeing something. This isn't imagination. This isn't conformity. This isn't peer pressure. They're seeing something. That's a very famous experiment. And you want to know what the last paragraph of the experiment is after they wrote it all up and they got famous? And this is Spiegel himself talking. They saw an increase in the left hemisphere, which is exactly what they saw with the people who the control group, but they saw firing happening in the right hemisphere, and basically saying, we don't know what's happening there. They're saying, we have no explanation for it. We don't know what they're seeing is the release. That's the mutual inhibition part. They're not even looking for it. And so, Dr. Spiegel, if you're watching this, go try to find that. If it's not there, it's not there, and I'm wrong. If it is there, the entire game changes. I'll leave you with one last thought. I got to be running out of time, right? Doctor, how long do I have? I got 5 minutes. I'll finish the 3 of the 5 minutes that I have with one more indirect supporting piece of information. Again, I don't know how many of you folks know this, but World War I was the first time that mechanized warfare was so horrific that literally people could not take it. They checked out. They experienced a state of mind that they termed shell shock. These people would either go catatonic, where they would not respond at all, or they would go into a repetitive motion, whatever it was, and they could not control the repetitive motion. There was no understanding of it. There was no chemical or drug. There was no treatment for it. What treatment do you think they finally found that showed success? Hypnosis. They called it suggestive therapy. Well, 99% of the soldiers that experienced shell shock experienced it because they were in the trenches during prolonged bombardments. The shell would blow up, they would flip, go in. I could conjecture that as either breaking the switch, exhausting the switch, screwing up the switch. They were locked in hypnosis. Why did hypnosis work as opposed to any other therapy? All of our phrasings, all the way we structure our suggestions, all the way we communicate with people are all designed to communicate with a person in a trance, in that simpler, more descriptive way of communicating. Theoretically, that's supportive of the notion of the switch. They had somehow damaged the switch by repeated, and it was only the people that got bombarded. Each time that thing would go off, they'd go into that state, and then all of a sudden they got locked. They couldn't get out. They either exhausted or damaged the switch, as a hypothetical. Now, I have much, much more to say about the theory of hypnosis. If you take that premise, I take it all the way back to its inception. You can ask Reverend Mitchell. I take it all the way back phylogenetically. Why did nature put that there? Why would that be there? How is that adaptive to the survival of man? And I have theories that take it all the way back, literally, to the inception, but I don't have background research on it. There are no studies that have demonstrated it. I can't produce any numbers. At that point, I'm just conjecturing. So I'm leaving that out. But this part is real. The studies are out there, the numbers are numbers, it's testable, and if they run these tests, they're either going to find it or they're not going to find it. And if they find the switch, well, folks, we have a new theory of hypnosis, and one that's testable, and one that might actually hold up to scrutiny, and one that might actually dramatically change the field in which we find ourselves devoting our lives in studying. If it's false, well, then I took my shot, you know. At least, you know, I mean, and you know, there's some place in the middle. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's certainly a different way of looking at it. Maybe I'll move the football 1 inch forward, and somebody will come along who's smarter than me, or looks at it with the correct point of view, and will pick up the ball and move it to the end line. At least I will have moved the damn ball forward, and at least my existence and my life devoted to this hopefully will have contributed something, because I do believe this is a truly original idea that has never been put forth before, and it's hard to find original ideas. Don't forget to see Jason Callahan next in his presentation. He asked me to mention to you. It's going to be great, and he wanted you all to go to his, so I promised I would mention it. I'm done. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you so much. Thank you.